United States has laid bare to its NATO allies that its primary security focus is no longer Europe. It's dashed hopes of Ukraine joining NATO and said that Ukrainian aspirations to return to the 2014 borders before the Russian invasion are unrealistic. For the Europe conversation, I catch up with the Lithuanian Defence Minister, Dovilė Sakalienė, who says Europe is at the beginning of a very difficult process. Well, Minister, we now know what the Trump administration says about the fate of Ukraine on a number of issues, in particular Ukraine's membership of NATO and Ukraine's demand that it return to the borders of pre-2014. The US is saying that is unrealistic. What is your response?
Well, first of all, I think that there were quite a few very significant messages that were sent today, and some of them are unpleasant, yet true, regarding financing, regarding contribution. But about what you said about Ukraine, Lithuania thinks that it's not questionable, that the borders are not questionable, that our international agreements, that international treaties that say very clearly that borders are unquestionable, hold true. Also, choice of the nations to join any defense alliances that they deem to be suitable for them is also unquestionable.
Ukraine does have its own choice to join NATO, but America has said that as a member of NATO, it won't allow it. It's going to refuse it. That is one of the demands of Vladimir Putin before the full-scale invasion of 2022. The US has essentially granted that now.
Well, as I said, we believe that it's a choice of every nation to initiate joining of any alliance that they deem acceptable for them. And therefore, this is a discussion that needs also to be framed very clearly. Ukraine has its own volition to express wish to be in any alliance. Within the alliance, of course, we can have discussions that may be easy or tough, in this case very tough. Yet it does not change the fact that the only sustainable long-term solution of Ukraine's safety is membership in NATO.
Okay, so do you feel that Ukraine is now in a stronger position, having been told in public that it's unrealistic to expect to be a NATO member and that any troops in Ukraine won't have NATO security guarantees?
I think we are in the beginning of a very difficult process where we will have to find the specific ways to generate strength. What is a good part of the message is that peace through strength was reiterated all around the room, including the United States.
What does that mean, though, if you've just weakened Ukraine's position?
As I said, I think we are in the beginning of that difficult conversation. And one of the elements which is going to be critical, and as I understand also there is an agreement in the room that it's necessary, is our own capabilities. Because how can we sustainably help Ukraine if our own defense capabilities are being developed slower than that of the aggressor? The size of Ukrainian army and the size of our defense industry, of our own defense capabilities from, well, I'm not going to go into details in this format, but anyhow, they are not matching the speed of Russian military industry, of Russian transition from peacetime to wartime economy, of Russian assembly of troops at a quite a threatening speed.
So what do you think should happen now?
First of all, I think that processing of information needs to happen as soon as possible, that talks are completely irrelevant right now. Funds and production is what is really relevant. Because as I said, if we really want to stand strong by Ukraine, and if we really want to stand strong in the face of Russia's preparation for the next stages of imperial expansion, then we need to be armed to our teeth, and probably more. And that needs to start happening quite soon. And therefore, in Europe, we need to have a discussion about swift and significant investment in defense of all NATO borders not in 2028, but now. By 2026, we need to have instruments that are capable of ensuring that all the states that are on the borders of NATO are fully protected. Because if infringement happens on 1 inch of the territory of, I don't know, Lithuania, Latvia, or Finland, then everybody falls.
So how does that happen when stocks are low now? Some would say depleted pretty badly. Production is pretty slow at the moment, and Donald Trump is saying that NATO countries have to move to 5%. I mean, Lithuania is doing very well at 4%, but there are countries like Canada, Italy, Spain who aren't even hitting 2%.
But we're going to do from 5 to 6% from 2026 to 2030, and it's not easy. It's actually very intense for us, but we understand what is at stake, and also the dynamics of GDP growth is quite different in different parts of Europe. So we need to take what's good and use it. And one of the things that is good is also our industry, investing in our industry and making defense industry a very significant element of our economy growth. Because if we had, in my opinion, the most humiliating situation when all Europe was trying to find 1 million ammo rounds for Ukraine, all of Europe, that cannot be repeated.
What do you think, though, Vladimir Putin will be thinking about today when he hears that NATO membership is off the table for Ukraine, despite the June summit in Washington, D.C. saying that there is an indestructible bridge for Ukraine towards NATO membership? It's irreversible.
Honestly saying, what is happening in Mr. Putin's head, I don't really care, because he is living in an illusion, and in his opinion, Russia's borders stop nowhere. I care more about how fast we are going to transform our economies, how fast production of ammo and weapons and platforms related to our defense is going to develop in Europe, and how fast we are going to be in a position of actual strength ourselves.
What was the response by defence ministers to that announcement by Pete Hegseth when he said no NATO membership for Ukraine, going back to 2014 borders is unrealistic? What was the reaction from defence ministers, including, of course, the Ukrainian defence minister?
Well, since that was a closed meeting, I would not rather share details, but the general message was very clear that Europe has contributed very significantly to support Ukraine, and it is going to continue. Another message was that Europe and the United States need each other, and that Russia and China are going to coordinate, and therefore Europe and Indo-Pacific are inseparably related, and therefore we do need to think about certain team action. As I said, I think that we are opening a very difficult chapter.
You think the Trump administration has made its decision and it's going to take a very hard line when it comes to Ukraine?
I think it's going to depend a lot on ability of Europe to pick up the pace.
What about that? Because we've heard Mark Rutte say that, you know, and Pete Hegseth said it today as well, that the ministers have to go back to their individual countries and explain to societies really what is at stake here. And potentially governments are going to have to shave off when it comes to maybe healthcare, education and other areas. I mean, where does this money come from a European perspective? What is Lithuania asking, let's say, the EU to do?
When we look back at the pandemic period, we realize that in the face of existential crisis, Europe is able to think creatively, to generate funds quickly for significant investments into repair of situation which is really bad. And therefore, now if we got maybe a little additional nudge, to put it diplomatically, well, probably a kick in the back from our large partner in the NATO alliance, then maybe we will also be able to think creatively. And I wouldn't bash against each other healthcare and defense, because certainly we can find some methods that would allow us to accumulate funds quickly and then pay off for this investment in our future. Well, that's probably what Hegseth said. It's investment in your own future and then pay it off in decades.
So you common borrowing from the EU, basically.
I think that's one of the options. And one of the options that would be also feasible. And other options are being discussed by our presidents, by our prime ministers, by our finance ministers. Our own Lithuanian finance minister and prime minister are also very active in developing certain proposals regarding certain joint solutions. Because, as I said, if we all understand that protection of our borders is our joint interest, we can manage. Europe can manage. And it's not about, just shaving off, as you said, healthcare and education. It's about using your brains and doing it now.
Just before I let you go, for those countries or those societies who maybe don't appreciate exactly the threat of Russia, particularly for a country like Lithuania, which in living memory has suffered from the Soviet Union, but also is geographically close to Russia, explain really what your concerns are about a belligerent Vladimir Putin, who's also been told that Ukraine won't get membership to NATO. What are your fears?
Memories, probably, because I come from a family that was persecuted by Russians. My mother was born in Siberia and barely survived. My family was imprisoned, tortured, murdered, and etc. We know that when Russians come, then your best case scenario is that you are imprisoned or deported. But most likely you will be raped, tortured, and murdered. And therefore, that is the threat that is actually looming over Europe right now. And if we understand that stopping the active front line in Ukraine means that Russia will immediately accelerate its accumulation of forces that it is gathering for the next imperial stage expansion, that means that we have a very short time period to get ready.
Well, Dovilė Sakalienė, Minister for Defence for Lithuania, thank you very much for joining us on the Europe Conversation.
Thank you.